Andante, Ani, and welcome to Se Kona Getso. My name is Leanne, and I'm an instructor and board member at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning, and I'm facilitating this series. I'm coming to you from my own territory today, Mittimatalik, Anishinaabe, Aki. Dechinta's head office is located in the gorgeous territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, and we would not exist as an organization without their generosity, patience, expertise, and magnificent understanding of their homeland. I'd like to welcome you all to this space. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and sharing this talk with us. I know it's a really busy time of year. At Dechinta, we are brought together by our care for the land, each other, and our desire to practice Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Dechinta is dedicated to creating a future of Indigenous cultural revitalization through a reconnection with the land. Through our programs, we strive to create Northern Indigenous communities that are radically self-determining, healthy, sustainable, and connected to Indigenous knowledge and practices. We aim to ensure that the education we offer is accessible to all community members, including parents, youth, women, and two-spirit, trans, and queer people. We have a mandate to serve the needs of Northern Indigenous populations through education, research, and community programs. We are mandated to deliver Indigenous-centered arts, culture, language, and educational programming in an innovative land-based environment. We are committed to build educational capacity and employment opportunities for students and youth in Northern Indigenous community. We aim to increase the accessibility of land-based programming for school-age youth, young adults transitioning out of high school and into post-secondary employment and their families. The Sekona Getso, or Women Are Strong speaker series, is meant to be a spotlight and a celebration of the incredible work Northern Indigenous women are doing as scholars, researchers, parents, artists, activists, and writers. In these pandemic times, it's also meant to be a space of respect and connection, of inspiration and affirmation in the North and beyond. I invite you to create with me a supportive, kind, and respectful environment for our speaker and all of our participants. We are facilitating a curated question and answer section at the end of the talk. Please type your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. Mary Rose Sundberg, founder of Goyatico in Dada, translated the name of this series for us, and I'm grateful to Mero for her support and for her audio clip. Masicho. Collective Broadcast is an artist-run collective specializing in live streaming and tech solutions for arts organizations and not-for-profits, and they're helping us with the tech side of things today, so miigwech to Scott. Sydney Krill has been making the fantastic posters and helping facilitate. Kelsey Wrightson has provided all kinds of support to make this series happen, and she is our executive director at Dechinta. We are honored that you're able to join us today. We'll be recording the webinar and we'll post the webinars on our website. Siku Allooloo is an Inuk, Haitian, Taino writer, artist, and community builder from Denendeh and Nunavut. She is a Dechinta alumni and often joins our staff team as a land-based coordinator, a facilitator, and educator. She has been leading Indigenous resurgence and decolonial work since 2012 through her artistic practice, advocacy, and cultural programming on the land. Her writing and multimedia work have been featured in Canadian Art Magazine, the Capilano Review, the Malahat Review, Briarpatch Magazine, The Guardian, and Graphic History's Remember, Resist, Redraw series, along with Dechinta instructor and artist Leanne Charlie. Siku is a wonderful comrade of mine and an amazing friend. And the title of her talk today is Tracing My Mother's Lines, Represencing Historical Indigenous Women's Activism. So join me in welcoming Siku to our series. Over to you, Siku.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Leanne, for that beautiful introduction. Usa Kasakabo is how we say good morning in my Taino language, which I'm very, very new at learning. Arikoma Bu Masicho, thank you so much for having me. As Leanne mentioned, I'm Haitian and Taino through my mother, her name was Marie-Hélène Laraque. She was from Haiti on the island now known as Haiti in the Dominican Republic. I'm also Inuit through my father, whose name is Siku Allooloo from Mittimatalik, Nunavut. And I myself was born and raised in Denendeh, and I belong to an extended Descendants and Mohawk family through my step-parents, Francois and Lesley Paulette of Tthebatthi, just outside of Fort Smith. So yeah, it's such a great honor to be here today to share about the work that I'm leading, as it has very much to do with some of the important seeds that were planted in me as a student in Dechinta. I was in the very first pilot semester way back in 2010, and it's such a joy to see where Dechinta is now, and to continue to be part of its journey. I'm grateful to have my niece Kaona joining on the Zoom today. I brought her with me to that first Dechinta semester, and she's an extension of the matrilineal lineage that I come from. In fact, her name is very much connected to the ancestral power of the work that I'm taking up as passed down from my mother. So we won't see her on the Zoom, but she's with us, and it makes me so proud and so happy. The first seed that was planted in me during that Dechinta pilot semester was a medicine wheel teaching shared by my Dene dad, Francois Paulette, which is also a teaching about the life cycle. He said that we come into the world as a spirit, and our first point of connection with the world and all of creation is through that spiritual connection. When we grow older, around the time of becoming parents, we develop our emotional connection, and then we mature into an intellectual connection, which is based on that foundation of spiritual and emotional intelligence. The final component we develop is physical, which is where we direct movement. He calls this the natural cycle of development, Denechanya, or the sacred path. He also calls it the path we walk, which is all about how to be a human being in balance with ourselves and creation. So that basically informs everything that I do. It starts with the spirit, with my connection to the spirit world, and it connects to emotions, and then together spending time with those inform my intellectual understanding of what it is that I'm drawn to or fixated on, and then it leads to my embodied practice. So I'm here to talk to you today about the work I'm doing to represent Indigenous women's activism from a period of the 1970s during the American Indian movement, the Red Power movement, the formative time in Denendeh, where the Dene Nation was created, and so many Indigenous leadership organizations were created in this formative time. And the work to represent Indigenous women's activism for me is indeed a spiritually and emotionally led process. that brings greater political and intellectual understanding, with the aim of creating tangible resources that can honor, affirm, and nourish all generations. I say represence because Indigenous women were always present in historic movements like AIM, the American Indian Movement, and the formation of the Dene Nation, which was formerly called the Indian Brotherhood of the NWT. But women were often sidelined or just simply overlooked, and therefore not reflected as prominently in the media at the time. We know that many of the land allocations that were carved out in land claims agreements are gendered, in that they often reflect important hunting locations, but not berry picking locations, for example, because our leaders were having to fight for our rights in colonial institutions to safeguard our territories and all of the cultural ancestral components that make up our ways of life, by representing them in colonially recognizable means. And that was through an exclusively male lens, which of course is going to overlook a few things. I don't mean to disparage any of the leaders or the shoulders that we stand upon or that carved out the world for us and that we've inherited. I'm just pointing out some of the blind spots that inevitably made their way through because of the way that the world was shaped, and because our leaders had to work in these adopted means and in this settler colonial imposed forum, and those were the only options. So now, as the world is changing and the time is opening up for some other histories and components that are part of this history to come forward, that's the part that I'm trying to help bring. So similarly, in historic Indigenous movements such as AIM and the Dene Nation movement, they were male dominated in the sense that the figureheads and the spokespeople were almost always men in a settler colonial society that only recognized and accepted male leadership and male voices. The extensive wisdom and steadfast leadership of Indigenous women that were standing beside these men, raising the next generation of Indigenous people. They were raising them often single-handedly, passing on the cultural and land-based connections, keeping the Indigenous world going, and in my mother's case, sustaining an entire communication network across North, Central, and South America. Their names are rarely found in books and films and lesson plans. At that first Dechinta semester, my cohort was most interested to hear about the women who were invisibilized during the 1970s movement, who supported the men that were positioned as figureheads, who were indeed brilliant revolutionary leaders, like my stepfather, Francois Paulette. We were often, we were in awe of them. We were completely in awe of them too, the leaders that are visible in the historical record, and their colossal legacy that carved the way for Indigenous self-determination that we were so proud to inherit. But we realized that it was only the names and faces of those male leaders that we were learning about. And because we were raised by strong mothers who were actively involved in prominent ways, we wanted to learn about them too. We were fortunate that a handful of those women attended Dechinta as facilitators for some additional programming during our semester, and that they finally agreed to share some of their insight and experiences from behind the scenes when they realized that we wouldn't stop asking, what about the women? So There are very important gaps in official representations of our histories and knowledge systems that are waiting to be witnessed and filled with our loving presence. As a researcher who has always had a passion for that historic formative time in Indigenous activism, I realized that there's really not much in the archives representing our women activists. So we have to create it. The way I'm doing that now as an emerging filmmaker is by tracing my mother's legacy, which since she passed away 21 years ago is held in the oral history that she instilled in me as a child, the memory of her loved ones, and a few archival fragments that I've been able to recover over the past decade. Scott, can we please cue the Indica trailer? As Scott does that, I'll just let you know the trailer is, it's my pitch trailer to secure development funding for the feature-length documentary that I'm working on, which is about this historic Indigenous activism and my work of trying to represence. Go ahead. This whole issue, 1975-76, is dedicated to Indigenous women of the Americas. My mom, she started this paper back in the mid-70s. Carmen, she was my mom's lifelong best friend. They considered each other sisters, and they ran this newspaper together.
The work that we did together was so powerful, you know what I mean? And it was so synchronized to each other. She had these writing skills that I didn't, you know? Her writing is like no other, you know?
Indica was the first bilingual pan-Indigenous newspaper, so it was published in English and Spanish. At the time, most of the things going on in Indian country were overlooked by mainstream media, and my mom started this newspaper so that it could unite Indigenous voices. There's this political awakening going on everywhere that Indigenous peoples were, and it was the first time that they were seeing their stories be represented. My mom was from Haiti in the Caribbean, which was originally an island known as Quisqueya. It's the very first place that a European empire colonized, and it's also the first site of Indigenous resistance. When she was active, when she was publishing this newspaper, she was one of the very first people to affirm her identity as a Taino person. A lot of her life's work was to prove that Taino people still exist. 21 years now after her death, there's a whole movement of Indigenous peoples from across the Caribbean who are reaffirming that identity and reclaiming language and spirituality and music and all of this kind of knowledge. A lot of the people leading that movement trace their kind of awakening as a mixed Taino person back to seeing this paper. She passed away in 2000, and I'm trying to piece together this history.
Indigenous rights, Indigenous justice, you know, earth justice, you know, all of that. It's so important, and it's her legacy, you know, you are her legacy.
Thank you, Scott. I should also point out that my mom had 4 children, and so I'm one of my mother's 4 children, and she has 4 grandchildren, and one of them is here with us. So I just want to also make clear that I'm not the only part of my mother's legacy, even though it may appear that way, the way that we made the pitch trailer. So I'm working with a handful of these original newspapers that my mom made. She lived in Berkeley, California in the 1960s and 70s, and she started this newspaper that only ran for I think 4 to 6 years and went out of print long before the internet. And so it's virtually unknown. I haven't come across mention of it in really in any of my research. And I spent my whole undergraduate degree in university studying Indigenous resurgence movements, Indigenous resistance. So the work I'm doing right now is to try and recover the full run of those Indigenous newspapers and make them accessible. So I have a handful of hard copies, the original hard copies that are about 50 years old now, that I've inherited and that different loved ones have sent me over the years. But I really don't have much to go on. And I only have very few photographs of my mom. But I know that the work she did was groundbreaking, that it was central to the early Indigenous resurgence movement that we're seeing thrive today, that it connected people across the entire Americas and also the globe, and that it helped spark the longest standing Indigenous resurgence movement in the world, that of the Taino nation. I know that my mom had many sisters who led similarly important work in their own nations and communities throughout the world, and that her name is remembered well. So my goal for the project is to highlight not only my mom's legacy, but the legacy of historic Indigenous women activists, land protectors, and leaders who stood up against injustice, who held up their communities and made way for their Indigenous worlds to survive. I want to ensure that their legacies are witnessed and made visible, so that current and future generations of Indigenous women activists can see themselves within this lineage, and truly for the benefit of all communities and everyone within our communities who deserve to inherit the fullness of this historic brilliance and gendered power. A lot of the ways that I know my mom and her close friend, who she considered a sister, Carmen Guerrero, whose voice you hear in that pitch trailer, the way that they operated was through a sisterhood, through an ethic of love and care and support, collaboration. They created a solidarity network that went hand in hand with this newspaper, and they were there at garnering support and building connections, real world connections between people across these different continents. So a lot of that is informed by who they are as Indigenous women and all the power that comes through that. And that's what I really want to try and make visible as well, is that ethic and those tools for community building, for world generating. In my research so far, I'm in the early stages. I've located more fragments of my mom's early work that are scattered in different places. But with COVID, it hasn't been possible to travel to the United States, for example, and spend time in the archives. I also have little expectation that I'll find very much in the archives, just given the shortfalls in representation. But I know that there are buried treasures out there, and I know that I'm going to find them. One of the things I keep in mind is that the documentation of Indigenous peoples and the creation of archives was originally and continues to be largely done by non-Indigenous people with an exploitive colonial lens, intentional or not. That's just the reality. So that documentation was originally meant to serve the colonial narrative of domination. So for this historic period of time, the 1970s, all of my parents actually would have been considered radicals. They would certainly have been surveilled by Canadian and American governments, which means that recovering any of those official records is actually an act of liberation. And repurposing them to fill in historic gaps is an act of narrative sovereignty. Archival records in the material sense were never meant for us, but we are within our right to reclaim them, remake them, and wield them to affirm ourselves. So as I go along, I'm also in the process of digitizing what I have in my possession with the aim of creating an archive that will be accessible through the documentary film, a mixed media art exhibition, and a printed anthology. The work I'm doing in this regard is also connected to the Taino resurgence movement, as our nation is in the midst of this massive movement to represence ourselves from colonial domination. Actually, to represence ourselves from extinction. So as I mentioned in that pitch trailer, my Taino ancestors were the ones that met Columbus. They led an armed rebellion that lasted about 13 years, and they won. They actually beat the Spanish conquistadors and forced them to sign a treaty with the European crown. So the Taino Treaty is actually the very first international treaty between an Indigenous nation and a European monarch. But you never, ever hear about that. Most people still don't know that the Caribbean is an Indigenous territory, that there still are Indigenous people that live there and come from there, and that the genetic makeup of what is now known as the Dominican Republic and Haiti and Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, that our Taino ancestry is in many cases the majority of that genetic makeup. So now, as Taino people are leading this longest running resurgence movement, I'm trying to help support that work as well, because a lot of our material culture that's housed in museums, for example, and the historic record that talks about our history and our people, our culture, they label us as extinct pre-Columbian people. So this is, it's an interesting kind of conundrum, because for so many Indigenous people, especially in the North, I'm sure, you know, everybody on the call today is well aware that our leaders forever have always been very adamant that we have to maintain our language, we have to maintain our territory, our connection to the land, our spirituality, our traditional knowledge, our ceremonial practices, our cultural ways of life. Otherwise, if we lose those, we cease to be who we are. Which, you know, those are they're extremely important. Of course, in the Taino case, we're on the other side of that. We have lost everything through colonialism. But the thing is, none of it is actually entirely lost. our languages, for example, were chopped up and dispersed and are now part of all of the Creole languages. And they've actually infiltrated, they're actually part of English as well and Spanish. A lot of the words that we use in everyday, a lot of our vocabularies actually comes from Taino words, like canoe was kanoa, hurricane was named for one of our gods, Rikan, cacao, cocoa, and hammock and barbecue, iguana. There's a lot of our language that has been, what's the word? To me, it's a metaphor for the way that our culture, which, you know, as Dene people say, everything comes from the land, the languages come from the land, who we are, everything comes from the land. For Taino people, everything comes from our territories as well. And though they may be overtaken, they may look different now, they may have morphed into Creole realities, and are now represented by a mixture of people. The Taino spirit is very much alive, and it's bringing things back that were, you know, they went through their cycle of being created the way that all of our cultures were created, and then moving through, if you think the medicine wheel cycle, moving through kind of like the physical embodiment of those, they're now cycling back in through the spiritually led process. So there are people reclaiming Taino language, Taino spirituality and medicinal practices, which are represented now. They're embedded in a lot of these other mixed cultures. So my mom, as I mentioned, was one of the early originators of that reawakening. And I am connected to a lot of her colleagues that are leading that important work. And from my very far corner of the world, I'm trying to assist by generating media that represents us as a living culture and a culture that is coming back into form. And so they're hand in hand, the erasure of Indigenous women and the erasure of Indigenous people and our narratives of resistance and sovereignty and regeneration. Those are all within our right. And I feel like part of my responsibility to carry my mom's legacy forward, because she instilled this in me when I was very young. And I have these pieces and I have to share the pieces that I have. So that's what I'm doing. I would like to show you one more clip that is part of a short film. It's an experimental short film that I'm in the process of finishing right now. It's kind of I'll give you a hint. It's like the film is through the perspective of the medicine wheel teaching. It might be kind of hard to see because you won't see the full film yet, but at least I wanted to show you a clip. By way of many loving connections, I have come to hold many pieces of you, and this bridge we're meant to build. I have always known your vision. I am praying for a way see it through, to share what we know as Taíno, represencing ourselves from this great vanishment. Wodo Taíno. We are sacred vibration in physical form that transcends, that transcends. So this is a film that I made. I'm finishing making, but I filmed it with Super 8 film, which is analog actual film. And I developed it using botanicals and plant medicines instead of chemicals as a developer, including some sage and sweetgrass that I picked back home in Denendeh, some cedar from where I am right now in Coast Salish territories, and flowers. A lot of the flowers that you'll see in the film they actually help develop the film itself. And so my land-based practice is very much, it's very much part of my artistic practice as well. And that connection remains very important, and it's embedded. So I'm kind of like, I'm losing my, I don't know how to end this. It's a little bit funny to be doing this without being able to see who is with us here in the call, but I know from Leanne that there's a lot of Indigenous women that join the speaker series, that attend the speaker series from across Denendeh. And I just wanted to let you know that I still think that the work of collecting those stories and honoring the women across Denendeh who were the backbone of the movement, not only for self-determination, but cultural continuity and resurgence in various ways, is very important. And I would urge anyone who feels a strong calling in that respect to take it up. Many of them are still alive and have led incredible work across these communities. Women like Joanne Barnaby, Denise McDonald, Lesley Paulette, Eileen Beaver, Jane Dragon, Ethel Lamott. Even your aunties, your mothers, and your grannies, other women in your life, whoever you see that is carrying on the culture and passing on the teachings and just leading in their own right, start gathering their stories and documenting their contributions, even just within your family, so that you can pass them on to your loved ones. That's extremely important, and they deserve to be recorded, they deserve to be remembered and honored, and they deserve to be passed forward to younger people who are going to benefit from their brilliance. So I think I'll end there. Arikomabu, Masicho, thank you so much for joining.
Miigwech Siku, that was really, really beautiful and moving and amazing, and such an honoring of that past generation of Indigenous women who were so invisibilized in our movements and in our communities and in our political actions, but really were the backbone of all of those actions. So we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone in the webinar would like to ask a question, if you can type it into the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. Siku, why did you choose to use Super 8 film? That seems like an amazing thing to be doing right now, and then also developing using botanicals as a developer. What made you want the aesthetic of Super 8?
It's more that I wanted like all of this is DIY, and I'm trying to reclaim not only like the archives themselves that are housed in these institutions and wherever they can be found, but I'm also trying to generate our own archives, our own records. And Super 8 film was actually developed as like the first home video mechanism. And so at the time, I think it was in the late 60s, it was like a very cheap, widely accessible way of that anybody could record their own family or whatever, you know. So I also connected with a woman, a filmmaker who she's part of this whole movement. It's a niche in the analog film world where it's called eco-processing, and it's developing using things like coffee. There's a process called caffeinol. She's part of a lineage of women filmmakers that are using teas and botanicals to develop in as well. And so I was just excited to connect with her, and we did some mentorship this past summer, and she taught me the process. Flowers for me are really important because I grew up with them in my grandmother's garden, and my first memory is actually in Haiti, in one of our family's houses, and running around a garden of flowers. And of course, flowers represent memory and when somebody passes and new life. So I knew that I really wanted to work closely with flowers and with our plant medicines, because when we're creating as Indigenous artists, we bring our own knowledge systems, our value systems, our practices, and it's a way for me to make this a ceremonial practice and to instill those other components, the spiritual and emotional components, and the way of using those materials in more of a sacred way. It's important to me that all gets embedded. So even if it's not as overt to recognize, I feel like what our people always have done was we always embedded love. We always embedded care and connection and to the land, and our ancestors and our loved ones was always part of it. So it's just a continuation of that.
How many issues of your mom's newspaper do you have?
Oh, that's a good question. So the newspaper was, I'm still trying to get a hold of the entire run of the newspapers. They were published from 1974 till 1978, I think. And I believe that they were quarterly, but I haven't been able to get into the archives to see the full run of them. And so in my possession, I think I have about 6 of the issues, and some multiple copies of some of the issues. Some of them are in really great condition. Some of them are completely disintegrating and I'm afraid to touch them. So I'm trying to find a place right now that will help me digitize high quality versions.
Yeah. Were other Indigenous women writing for the newspapers?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. My mom and Carmen wrote a bunch of the articles. A lot of the articles were actually written by people themselves from their own territories, sending them in and sending in the photographs and saying, this is what's happening in our territory.
And what kind of issues in the were people talking about? What kind of articles?
they were talking about sterilization happening in the United States, sterilization of women. They were talking about incarceration, a lot of incarceration of leaders, killing of leaders. They were exposing genocide that was being led by mining companies and forestry companies in South America. They were talking about you could see in one of those clips, the First World Congress of Indigenous People, a lot of the gatherings that were happening, that were just starting. Also the pipeline, the Mackenzie Valley pipeline resistance, the Denendeh Declaration, the formation of the Denendeh Nation is in there, all kinds of things. It's really incredible.
Are you planning on making a trip to the archives to once we can travel again, if that's ever going to be possible?
Yes,
yeah.
I have, like, as soon as it's safe to travel, I'm going to be meeting with Carmen, my mom's best friend and collaborator. We'll be going to the archives in Berkeley, where I can see that they have the full run of the issues, but when I've contacted them, they said that they don't know actually if it's hard copy, and if it's hard copy, they don't know what shape they're in. So it's in some like distant storage locker that's been hidden away for 50 years. So we'll see what we can find. I'm also going to be traveling whenever it's possible to go do some research at the Smithsonian, which has it has a huge record of Indigenous activism, a lot of photographs and like really well documented stuff in there. And it also has a lot of Taino cultural objects. I want to travel and do as much in-person research as I can as soon as that's possible.
You showed us a clip, a trailer for your film. Can you talk a little bit more about your documentary? Is it feature length? When is it going to be out? Sort of what is it sort of documenting your journey, or is it focused on more the work that your mom was doing?
That's a very good question, Leanne. I usually don't have a clear sense of what the end product is going to be, because I stay so much in the process as I'm making it, and the end product is always the very last thing to come to form. So for now, I'm envisioning this more as just trying to document what I can find in the historic record, trying to document whatever people will share with me about what they remember from their experiences in connection with this newspaper, with the American Indian movement. There are a handful of really prominent women whose stories were able to make it through, like Buffy St. Marie, for example, who was like censored and not able to, she wasn't even able to get her music heard for a period of years because she supported Indigenous movements in the 1970s. And so there's a lot of women I know that are around that I would really like to connect with, basically in all corners. And I think that the intergenerational journey is important. So my part of my journey will be in the film, but it's really about Indigenous women and the Taino Nation as a collective, as a community. It's really for all of us. So I think the personal journey is important, and we all come from our own personal journeys and connections and things that are passed down. So I will share a bit of that, but more so I'm really excited to see the faces that we never get to come across and hear the stories that we never get to see. I was very fortunate recently that my aunt actually sent some of my mom's things, and some of the things she sent are photographs that my mom took back in the day. I'll show you one. It's from a protest in California in 1972. And it shows the women marching.
Wow.
And like, I just cried when I saw this, because so much of what was documented and what circulated, we only see the men's faces and hear their voices. And I'm just excited to share, to reclaim, recover, and to share more of the picture.
Do you have any plans on interviewing that rad list of Dene powerhouse women that you said at the end of your talk that were so crucial to organizing in the 1970s around the pipeline and the inquiry and the Dene Nation, the formation of the Dene Nation? Do you have any plans to document any of that work? Going right back to that first cohort that wouldn't stop asking, what were the women doing? What about the women?
Exactly. We were hounding them. They were there. Jane Dragon was there showing her like fur collection, and Denise McDonald was there leading a health and community health course. They were there not to talk about their involvement or their experiences or anything political. They were there to share, some of their current work that they're leading. But yeah, we were really, really blessed that they finally opened up. It is a dream of mine to lead that research, but I don't feel like I have ownership over that, and that I shouldn't have ownership over that. And I'm not in Denendeh. I actually haven't been able to even come back for the last 2 years because of the pandemic. And I think that it's important for all of us, for anyone in our communities, anyone that is part of our nations has the ability to take up that work and to be documenting, to be creating our historic record, to be representing us. And I think that it's, I'm finding for myself, it's incredibly meaningful, beautiful work to connect with the lineage of my mother. And these women have other relatives across Denendeh, and I think that I just want to put the call out there. Anybody can take this up, and I really encourage you to.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I'm so looking forward to the anthology and the documentary. And I'm so looking forward to hearing about your adventures at Berkeley and the archives and the Smithsonian. This is really, really important, beautiful, powerful work that you're doing. And I think it's just going to be an incredible gift to so many people. And I just have so much respect for Represencing Indigenous women activists in the present and in the history. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. Our next speaker is Leela Gilday on December 7th. So watch for our posters and help us spread the word. And I put the registration link in the chat. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Siku, and I hope everyone has a good day and is able to join us again in December. Bye now.
You take care.